talk about today is the cult.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, that is a very blunt umbrella term way of talking about it. Oh, yes,
yeah, okay. Not really. But, can you give us a little background on your beginnings in the faith, like your upbringing?
Yeah, so I usually start talking about this because I've had I've made enough new friends that I get to the point in like each friendship where like we'll be talking about our childhood or something, like about movies we would watch or like things we do, and I'd be like, I didn't do that, or like, and like there's only so much you can talk about without being like, okay, so this was my experience as a child.
Right.
So I usually start out by being like, by kind of explaining just like I don't know very much about I know enough about the Second Vatican Council, mm-hmm. and enough to know that there were a lot of people who there was obviously issues in the church before the Second Vatican Council, and when the council passed the changes in the Mass and the new order of the Mass, a lot of those broken places in the heart of the church definitely came to light. And, there were a lot of, priests and religious who kind of fell away from the proper practice of the Mass and the proper practice of the faith. And there were a lot of people who looked around and saw the world kind of as the way it was becoming. And they decided that they needed to restore some of the tradition and some of, the goodness and adherence to the faith that was part of the church before the Second Vatican Council. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay. So one of these groups, was a bishop named Marcel Lefebvre, and he started a priestly order called the Society of St. Pius X. And this order, it was kind of like any other religious order where, there'd be different seminaries that would train priests in the way of this order that, its intention was to be very traditional and very, very adherent to the original form of the Mass and to everything pre-Vatican Council, pre-Second Vatican Council. So basically he created this order that only practiced the Mass in Latin, the Tridentine rite of the Mass, and where things essentially looked identical to pre-Vatican II Roman Catholicism. So I think there was, the idea there was I hesitate to say a good idea in itself, because I truly believe that the Holy Spirit guides the church, and anything major like that he allows to happen in the church, he does for a reason. So I don't want to say that the Second Vatican Council was bad, because I believe that the Holy Spirit is truly guiding the church. But people don't always trust and aren't able to always exercise that faith, and when they see issues, they want to remediate those issues. So this group sought to remediate the modernism that they found in the church, and they grew their one of their big parishes is in St. Mary's, Kansas, which is this little town half an hour, maybe 45 minutes away from Topeka, Kansas, the Kansas City area. It's maybe an hour and a half. And my parents met there, and the community that they came into was a little bit more than just a traditional form of the Mass. It was a little bit more, there were some things that had started off as good things that had kind of gone astray. And so my father got into this group when he was in his late teens. It was a decision he made for himself. He was very self-sufficient and had done a large part of raising his 8 younger siblings. So he that was a decision he made on his own. But my mom was raised in the group, so she went to boarding school in high school at at the St. Mary's High School, which is totally boarding school. So from that point on in her life, she, they only wore long skirts. They, were forced to veil at Mass, which, is a veil is a sacramental. There's, plenty of good things about veiling, but I don't believe in forcing when Rome is saying something different. I don't believe in the forcing. So yeah, a lot of stuff like that. And then, but to her parents, when they got into it, they were just like, oh, this is a thriving, like, close-knit Catholic community, and they preserve the tradition, right? So that was kind of what they were looking for. But when my mom went into the convent when she was 18, and when my dad respectively went into their seminary, in, I believe it was in Winona, which is in Wisconsin, I think. Don't quote me on that. Goodness gracious. But
that sounds right, but
I
also don't. I confirm or deny.
Like, I'm neither going to confirm nor deny. Okay, yeah, but they found that the group went a little bit deeper and a little bit darker than that. And that what looked like a very tight-knit Catholic community had a lot of like cancerous ideas in the upper echelons or the higher parts of the group. So there were bishops in that group that there were 7 bishops that were consecrated without the permission of Rome, and then they were excommunicated for that. I believe the leader was also excommunicated from the church because they completely abandoned, not completely abandoned, but they called what happened after the Second Vatican Council a crisis in the church. Mm-hmm. And I do this with quotation marks because they're like, oh, it's a crisis in the church. And this basically gave them, in their mind, the permission to believe that, okay, Rome is so wrong, and that there's like special circumstances that allow us to do things that the Pope isn't sanctioning, and because we don't agree with the Pope, and the Pope is technically the Pope, but also like there's a crisis and something is wrong, and we have to be the people to protect the Catholic faith. So they kind of got this idea that they were like, we are the center of the Catholic faith. We are the only place where you can still practice the true Catholic faith. And as my mom was a sister in their order, and she was in France, which was, if at all possible, even more like radically into this like mindset than the American people tended to be. But she definitely got indoctrinated with this idea that this is the only true faith. Like it was kind of present in the people, but this is the only true place you can practice the faith. Like the modern world is wrong about so much, which it is, but like it was very radical. And then also what was the other? Oh, and then there was the anti-Semitism, which is she found that, not she found, but there were bishops and priests who would come in and teach her and the nuns, and they were teaching them things that were very anti-Semitic. There was Holocaust denial, and like even like partial Holocaust denial is actual Holocaust denial. Like when they're like, oh, like these people, like some people died, but it wasn't really anywhere near as many as they say it was. And then there was also a bishop named Bishop Williamson who was claiming that like the gas chambers were not like did not contribute to any major form of genocide. So I don't know, that sounds probably really crazy because it is, but there was a lot of that going around. And then there was also a lot of anti-women rhetoric, that we believe in like the complementarity of the sexes and in respective geniuses given to masculinity and femininity from God. But this group was very much patriarchal in the worst sense, not in the true good sense, but they were very radically anti-women going to college. There was an article that I read from this bishop that like was like, why women can't think, and it was like it was, well, the basic gist of it, and he says these phrases, is that true ideas are for universities, and as true ideas are not for true girls, then universities are not for true girls. And he also talks about why women shouldn't wear trousers, again in quotation marks, because that's what we call them. Sure. And then, so it was a lot of like anti-women and anti-Semitic rhetoric, and then there was a whole movement that was trying to bring the faith back to the land, so it was called the Back to the Land movement. It was very much about like technology is evil, and like we need to like totally bring everything back to its, this idea that like there was a point in history where everything was good, and we have to return to that point in history because everything since then is bad. Does this make sense? Yes. So far? So my family started out in that group, and my parents started seeing a lot of things they didn't like a lot of like connections to like neo-Nazism. Like my mom talked about there being a priest who would walk around, I believe it was her home parish, and he'd have a Nazi armband on, and like there were priests in St. Mary's who'd like they'd have like viewing parties of like Holocaust stuff, but like Nazi stuff. What? With like kids in the with like youth, and this was a long time ago, like 20 years ago now, but it was so a lot of crazy stuff like that. So my parents started this little report that they put together called the LaFlock Report, and I remember I was like 5 years old, and I remember like not being allowed in the kitchen at night because mom and dad had people over, and they were like having these like hushed meetings is what I remember, and they were writing because they wanted to reform the group. They didn't want to leave, because when you're in a place that tells you that it's the only place you can be truly Catholic, and you have that banged into you for so many years, you're not just going to be like, oh yeah, well everything else is fine. Like you're going to be like, oh my gosh, if this is the only place you can really be Catholic and there are these evil men in the group, we want to get the men out. So their first goal was to preserve the group. It didn't end up happening like that so much. They released 1 or 2 issues, I think, and we moved to Kansas City in there and continued going to a society parish away from the town, which is like 90% society. Like it's some crazy high percentage of Catholics, and it's like every single house has like Marian statues out in front of it, which is cool until it's creepy, and then it's not cool. You know, like there's just something that feels a little off about it. But we moved out of that town, and we moved for my dad's job. But it was at this point that like my dad got called in by some of the priests, and they were like, they very strongly suggested to him that he needed to stop. Like that they were not in support of what he was writing about the group. So instead of them being like, oh my gosh, like of course this stuff is horrible and it's happening, it's, you know. So at that point my dad was like, we're leaving. They're trying to get me to shut this down. They're not seeing all of this. We're leaving. So we went to a church called Old St. Patrick's, which is in Kansas City, and that's something Priests of Christ the King. I forget the group, but it's another Latin Mass group but it's not society. So we went to that group, and then we got put in Catholic school, and at that point, once my brother and I started going to Catholic school, like we started kind of phasing towards just the regular, they call it the Novus Ordo, again in quotation marks, but we started phasing towards there. And at that point, like a lot of healing in our family started, and like my mom and dad had to start kind of reevaluating the way they saw their faith and the way they saw God. And we had to kind of start doing that too, because there was a lot in our very early formative years that was very messed up, and that kind of taught God as like this punishing, like dictative figure rather than a father who loves us. So there was a lot of just woundedness from that. And then also there's like, you know, the fun stuff that you have to relearn. Like I went to my first mass, just a regular mass, when I was 7 years old, and I cried through that mass because I've been told that the mass where the priest was facing the people and he wore the different clothes was evil, and it was all in English, and I thought it was evil. So I was like, why did my parents leave me here? Why are they letting me do this? Like, what's going on? Why is the music so pretty but it's still evil? Like, I was so confused. So there was that when I was 7, and then, you know, I wore my first pair of jeans in public. I remember going to, I think we went to Target and like getting my first pair of jeans. I was so happy to be able to wear pants. Like, I thought I was a rebel. I literally thought I was such a rebel for wearing like Target jeans with like the little, you know, they were like the little girl ones that had like the neon blue and pink like stars on the sides, because that's what, you know, when we were like 9. But yeah, so there was lots of crazy stuff like that. We had to kind of relearn. You know, I found out Hannah Montana wasn't evil when I was in like 6th grade, and that was great. And then, yeah, it was a lot of re-assimilation, but
yeah, that's crazy. I don't even know what to follow up with that.
Yeah.
What was the biggest shock to you?
The biggest shock in what way?
Oh, I guess I should clarify. The biggest shock when you kind of got reacclimated to the real world.
I was, well, there was definitely a lot of, like, this is really interesting because my kind of reacclimation to the real world was my growing up. So, like, up until I was, like, 7, we were one way. So, like, all of my, like, deeply formative, like, young years, we were one way. And then when I, got into, like, normal Catholic school in 2nd grade, it was, like, relearning stuff. So I think, like, the biggest shock was, like, all of it. Like, having to completely, like, learning that things that I thought were evil were actually fine. And also learning that, like, the group didn't have, like, the monopoly on the only way to, like, live the Catholic faith. Because there was, I was so deeply disgusted by just regular Catholics at a small age. Like, when we were leaving the group, we would go to this parish that had, like, they had a Tridentine Mass, so a Latin Mass, and then later that day, just the regular parish would have their regular Mass. So I'd go to Latin Mass with my family, and then once after Mass, my mom wanted to go to confession, so I sat and I was, like, cradling my baby brother in the pew waiting for her, and I saw the regular Catholic priest coming, because he was going to say Mass soon, so he was walking down the aisle in his vestments, and I knew they were different because they look different than the Latin Mass vestments. And so I, like, immediately recoiled, and I remember he, like, gave my little brother, like, a blessing on his head, or he just touched his head because he was, like, a new baby at the time, and I was, like, disgusted. I was like, how dare this man touch my brother? And I was, like, a 6-year-old. Like, what do you have to be a 6-year-old and, like, see this man and think he's just evil? So there was just so much, like, having to like, reform, like, no, this isn't bad. No, this is not sending you to hell. No, this is not evil. And then also, like, I think there was definitely a little bit of just, like, confusion in there because of just the way, like, my parents were learning a lot. So they were, like, when they read Pope Benedict's writings, shout out to Pope Benedict the 16th, they were like, what? Like, this man is still teaching all this stuff that the Catholic faith should be teaching. Like, so I know that was the biggest shock for my parents, or at least a very big shock for my parents, that when they read his writings, they were like, oh my gosh, all of the stuff that we were told didn't exist in the regular Catholic Church is being taught by the current Pope. Like, that was a huge shock for them when they were reading his stuff in, I think it was in, like, Jesus of Nazareth. And
I'm reading that right now.
Really?
Yeah.
That's so cool. Yeah, but they were reading, I remember they read that, and there were some of his other writings that they read, and they were like, and this is something obviously that I didn't know at the time, but that they've told me more recently. They were like, they were very surprised that, they were still teaching everything about the true presence and everything about, like, the, just the deep beauty of our faith that has been handed down for more than 2,000 years. It's like, it's a shock, but it's, it's kind of amazing to learn that it's still there. And yeah, I think because of that, like, that's definitely affected me to the point where, like I, my opinions about tiny church politics stuff, like, have gone away slowly over the years, because I'm like, I don't even want to get involved in, like, this, like, should people be doing the sign of peace? No sign of peace. Sign of peace? No sign. I'm like, I don't care. Like, people getting, like, the veiling debate, I don't, like, I love to listen to people's opinions. I think it's beautiful when young women do it. I don't. Because I was forced to when I was, and I just bad taste in my mouth. But sure, I think it's so beautiful when when I see you veil, I'm like, oh, she's so gorgeous. But just stuff like that, like all the little, like, oh, Mass ad orientem, that is one that, like, I heard Father Mike Schmitz talk about the Mass. Like, he did a talk about the Mass, like, facing away from the people, and he talked about it in a way that was very not, like, polarizing, and I was like, you know what, that's actually really cool. But for the most part, like, all the church politics, I just want to step away from, because at the end of the day, I am a daughter of the church. Like, that is my place as a daughter of God and a daughter of the church. And the day that I stop believing that Christ is truly present in his church and that the Spirit is leading his church, that's the day that I've, lost my faith. So I just never want to be in a position again where I believe that the true faith is somewhere other than, just at home in Rome, in the living, breathing, changing, but not really changing Catholic Church.
Yeah. Do you think it's been difficult for you to find kind of your role in the church from your background? Like, I'm sure there's been a lot of healing with that and, like, the way that they raised you to view, especially women in the church. So have you struggled, like, healing from that and, like, finding that place?
I think there's definitely been a lot of back and forth because, I went from being in kindergarten where they would make the girls sit behind the boys. Like, they would split our kindergarten class, boys, girls, and they'd make the boys go in the row in front of the girls so that the girls, like, and I remember my teacher shushing me and being like, don't distract the boys. Like, so there was very much the mentality of, like, men first. And when I came out of that, I think I felt a lot of resentment. And, like, there was a lot of, like, not to use, like, a charged feminist term because I would not consider myself a feminist at all. But, like, I was like, oh, there's so much, like, it's so, like a bit misogynistic, which I guess that would be actual misogyny, is when they're like, boys, you need to hear this more than the girls do. Mm-hmm. But so I definitely perceived that there was a lot of that. And I was like, I immediately want, like, once we started going to normal churches, like, girls could altar serve. I was never allowed to because that was not something my parents were okay with. And now I'm like, I've mellowed out and I'm like, you know what? Altar serving is kind of like, I see it as a little, like, preparation for priesthood kind of thing. Mm-hmm. So I'm like, I'm not going to die on that hill. Like, I would not let my daughters altar serve because that's not going to be their vocation. But also, like, St. Therese was a sacristan, so I don't believe that women don't have a place in the Mass at all. Mm-hmm. But there was definitely that little bit of a struggle. Like, there was first a total, like, there was, like, a bit of a rebellious and, like, an angry spirit of, oh, these people are trying to oppress women, because there was that, but also I was young and idealistic, so I only had what my parents were telling me, and I was just angry. And then when I went to Ave Maria, actually, there was a much more prevalent community of very traditional young Catholics. So that was the first time that I met people and became friends with people that seemed normal, but that were also, like, veiling and going to the Latin Mass and talking about the Latin Mass and talking about, like, the sign of peace and stuff like that. So I got a little bit, like, not hooked back in, but when I talk to my mom now, she was like, look, like, 7 months ago, you were telling me that you wanted to get married at a high Latin Mass again. And I was like, yeah, that's because it's gorgeous, but it's also not the ordinary rite of the Catholic Church. So, like, I wouldn't. But, I definitely went back into my phase where I allowed myself to become very idealistic, because, like, when you want to serve God and there are all these people telling you that this is the best way to do it, it's so easy. Even if you've learned all this stuff, like, I should have known, but even if you've learned all this stuff that I've learned, when there are all these people being like, this is the best way to practice the Catholic faith, and this is the glory you owe to God, and, like, this is the best way to blah, 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 it's so easy to get sucked back into that. So I think there's definitely, I had my little rebellion phase, I had my kind of little mini try it out again phase, as more of an adult, but ultimately I have came back, like, I've come back to the same place and the same attitude, which is that none of the politics is important. What is important is, like, making sure that I get to heaven, making sure that if I'm called to marriage, that my spouse gets to heaven, and making sure that I'm calling my family higher and inviting them into relationship with the Trinity, because that's the true purpose of my life, not church politics, not the the little petty quarrels of whatever. And if there's a reverence in the Mass, then my duty is to bring one person to that Mass who is being reverent and who is putting Christ at the center of their Mass. So I'm not gonna listen and partake in the conversations where people are like, oh, these people are so irreverent. I'm like, probably, like, there's probably people who aren't catechized enough, because there's huge catechesis issues in the church. But, if there's people who don't know and who aren't aware of the beautiful sacrifice of the Mass that is happening on the altar in front of them. I don't want to be one more person who walks into that church and sits at the back and crosses my arms because I'm better than them, because I know what the truth is. Because that's one more person who's leaving Jesus alone on the altar, and I don't want that.
Whoa. That was really good.
Thanks.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's such a great way to look at it, too. And it's like, even like, you don't want to be the apostles at the Garden of Gethsemane falling asleep outside.
Yeah.
And like not caring for Jesus in the proper way. And like focusing on the people of the Mass is not what Jesus is calling us to.
No.
Like, the Mass is for the liturgy of the Word, which is words from God, and the liturgy of the Eucharist, which is God.
Which is us sacrificing to God and Him sacrificing back. It's like literally like a marriage ceremony.
Yeah.
Which is so cool.
Right. And it's like looking forward and not looking side to side. Like, you're meant to be focused on the altar and not on the people around you.
No, I totally agree.
Yeah. Have there been any opinions that you had when you were involved in the society that you still hold now?
That's a really good question. Like the entire Apostles' Creed, I'll just start, like, essentially okay, see, it's funny, because it's like all the facts, or at least most of the facts are the same facts, but the whole soul of the facts is different. Does that make sense? Like, it's like you can believe the same thing, but if you don't know the person, then you can, like, two people could say the same thing about a person, but if one of the people knows that person and the other one doesn't, then what they're saying sounds completely different. So I think that's one I'd have to think about. Are there any?
I know it's kind of a broad question.
Yeah, I think definitely, like, definitely all the church ethics things about, you know, no, I'm sure there are, because there's so many opinions that on paper haven't changed, is what I'm trying to say. Okay. But definitely the spirit of my faith, and I feel the spirit of my family's faith is very, very different. I guess I still don't think girls should be altar servers, but that's the most trite, like, non-important thing on the planet. I believe that Jesus is truly present in the Eucharist. I believe that He died for us. Everything's the same. It's just now it's deeper because it's more fully united with Rome.
Yeah. Has it been difficult for you at any point to continue being Catholic, considering, like, that was your introduction to it?
No. That's the one thing that has never, there have definitely been points where, like, I was a little, like, not as attentive to God's voice in my life, but, and I know that one common thing that I've seen happen with a lot of people that I know who have left that group, or a lot of people who have left the group, as well as some people that I know personally who have left the group, is that they do find the way they view their faith forever altered, or they leave the faith entirely. That does happen. But for me personally, and I think this is a huge debt of gratitude I owe to my parents, but my parents were very much, I always viewed them as, like, looking for the truth in what was there, and, like, really trying to seek out what God's way actually was. So instead of me just being angry at the whole Catholic faith, I think I very much just, well, one, I got to, you know, take out all my anger on the group itself, but because we were, like, transitioning into the Catholic faith, I felt like more like I was able to learn more about what the faith actually was, and more like I was able to take it on as my own, and I, you know, it's obviously just a total grace of God, and also, like, He gave me parents who wanted to know what was really there, who didn't want to just be mad, but they, you know. Right. Which, yeah.
Right, which is, like, a lesson in not to be upset with redirection, is, you know, because, like, what like, the society intends is not always wrong. Like, obviously the way that they go about it, and a lot of, like, their methods are wrong. Yeah. But, like, the strive towards God and bringing what is best for God, like, that intent is good. And it's just discovering what that is. and what, like, that's a journey, and just because you don't find the right way the first time doesn't mean that all the ways are bad.
Yeah. No, I definitely, yeah. My only issue with or not my only issue, but I think the issue with the way the society or the SSPX was looking for God was that they were looking for him through like physical practices of the church, which are incredibly important and given to us through God, so I'm not discounting those. But like as soon as you start to rely on like the physical details of how many times the priest bows his head in the liturgy of the Eucharist and like, you know, or whatever have you, like oh my gosh, my teacher says that and I hate that. It's what have you. Okay, anyway. I got sidetracked, but whatever it is, I think their issue is that they definitely focus their church lives and their relationships with God around this kind of punitive, very like, you do this, then you do this, then you do this, and this is on you, and it's very much, yeah, not a way to God that involves drawing closer to the heart of God. It's very Jansenistic, which is like the, you know, the movement that was kind of more towards like the punitive side, right. And that was, you know, that was big. I forget if it was, I think it was Teresa of Avila, like when she, or no, maybe it was Teresa Lisieux. It was probably Teresa Lisieux who battled Jansenism. My mother would know better than me, but it's just this whole idea of God as Punisher, and God is kind of like, or they'll say, they're like, you know, like my grandfather and I remember once I was, you know, a couple of years ago, I was talking to my grandfather who's still in the group and whom I love dearly. But I was talking to him and he said, or I said to him, I was talking to him about having a personal relationship with God. And he said, well, technically, yes, you're supposed to have a personal relationship with God, but that's what the Protestants call it. So we don't call it that. Like, we don't, like, they don't like to talk about, like, it's very formalized and very just, like they don't, there isn't a way to have a relationship with God that's not personal.
Right, it's meant to be personal.
Yes, because it's a relationship.
Right.
Like, if you don't have, I don't have a personal relationship with my principal from high school. You know, like, God can't be your principal from high school.
No, he's not meant to be that way. Like,
no.
Why would he have come to die on the cross and form human relationships if that's not what it was for?
No, he literally, like, you, Eve, were an idea in the mind of God, right? Mm-hmm. And then he created you, and you were born, and then you needed redemption, so his son died for you because he loved you and couldn't imagine heaven without you, and he needed you to be there, you know? Like, there's nothing that's not deeply personal about that.
Yeah, or even the whole Bible itself, like, all the connections and the typology, and it shows the intentionality of God. Like, he does not leave anything out. Like, every single part of our life and, like, every single part of our being is so intentional.
And he tells us that.
Yes, and you can't have an intentional being without love, because then it would just be mushing a bunch of stuff together and calling it good enough, and like that's not what God is. God doesn't look at something and say that, oh yeah, that's good enough. Like, no, he says like that's a very good thing.
Yeah.
And I cherish that.
I totally love that. Yeah, and I think that's, you know, just the heart of like what's so broken at the core of our culture is just that we, you know, we spend our entire lives looking for someone to tell us that we are that beloved person, because we're made like that. That's our deepest desire, is to be seen and known and loved, and to be fully accepted for who we have been created to be fully seen as the image of God that we are, and then to be able to fully give that gift in sacrificial love to another person or to other people. And, you know, we're not able to do that as much in our modern, like, in our modern society that's very connected to like instant gratification, not to use like 800 buzzwords at once, but yeah, I definitely think that that's something we need to find our way back to.
Yeah, the deepest desire within our heart is love. There's a reason for it. It's not just there because...
Yeah, but also that it's the deepest desire within God's heart too. It's like, it's not just our heart. I mean, like God doesn't need us, but he wants us very, very, very badly, you know, and like he is a creation, like relational, not creation, that's not a word. He's a relational being in himself. You know, like God cannot exist. God does not exist with that, like he is a communion of beings. Mm-hmm. You know, like he in himself is relational. There's the world started, you know, with like by the hand of this God who is already this eternal like motion of lover, beloved, created love, lover, beloved, created love, you know, in the Trinity. And that's so cool. And it's, you know, it's like everything from our faith. I feel like you can be asked any like hot button issue question from today, and the answer to it always goes back to like Trinitarian love. Mm-hmm. You know, like any question, like whether it's on like the issue of abortion or the issue of like marriage and family issues or anything like that, it all goes back to like human beings falling away from remembering that love is total self-gift to the other, and that it's modeled after the Trinity.
Yeah. And how neat is it that we get to, like, if God's desire is to love and our desire is to love, like, how neat is it that we can share in some way in that with God, like, that we can relate to him in that. Because sometimes it seems like he's, like, so far away, like, has all these qualities, and of course he, like, loves and accepts love so differently than we do, but, like, it's so beautiful that he made us in our image, or not in our image, in his image.
He made me in my own image.
My own image. It was just so great. No. In his image, that we can share in those same qualities.
Yeah, but also, like, he does love in different ways than us, but I think it's also to remember that, like, the human heart of God beats in Jesus Christ in heaven. You know, and like with a human heart, when he became human, he opened himself up to like experiencing the full range of human emotion. Mm-hmm. You know, which is something that there's this really fantastic book called Consoling the Heart of Jesus that is like, it's like a little mini Ignatian retreat stuffed into a book. It's one of my favorite books on the planet. And it talks about the human heart of Jesus and how like we forget that he feels pain when he's rejected, and that he needs that love from us in a way that we can understand, because he can feel rejection and he can feel that need for love in the same way that we can. There's the magnificence and the need for love of God goes beyond anything we can comprehend. That's absolutely true. But I think it's also important to remember that there is that like totally human element of God's heart that needs to be loved in a very human way. And that, you know, also isn't like he loves all of us so much. He's giving so much love, but it's not returned. And yeah, and also like just that you were talking about like God can feel far away, and I'm like, yeah, he can feel so far away, but I think that the only way to remedy that is to remember that like our very selves are meant to be a home for the Trinity. You know, we're meant to be able to, we're meant to be living tabernacles and like houses for the Trinity. And that was Elizabeth of the Trinity's that was her whole like mentality, and her whole kind of mission was to like foster this love for the internal presence of the Trinity, like this like secret or gift that you're holding like within yourself, because it's like God is truly present outside in the world, but he's also truly present like in a very like real way in your heart.
Yeah, that's so beautiful, and you're so beautiful. So thank you for coming on this podcast
Thank
today.
you.
I've really loved this conversation. I know so many people are going to like listen to this and be like, wow, like this is the best, because you just have so much wisdom, and the things you say are so eloquent, and so like you're such like a classy and elegant person.
Thank you.
That yeah, I think people are really going to benefit from this podcast. So thank you for coming on and sharing your witness. And yeah, it's been great.